The Locked Room, Part 2. Weeks had passed since Sarah had mysteriously disappeared. The old house remained silent, untouched, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent shutters banging. Her brother, Mark, arrived in town to search for answers. No one knew where she had gone, and the house was the last place anyone had seen her. Mark had heard the stories, the warnings from their grandmother about the locked room at the end of the hall. As a child, he'd laughed them off, assuming they were just silly superstitions. But now, standing before the old house, he wasn't so sure. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The atmosphere felt wrong, colder than it should be. Dust swirled in the faint light, and the house groaned as though it was alive. Mark's stomach churned as he glanced down the long hallway. The door at the end was slightly ajar. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't turn back. Sarah had to be here. He approached the door slowly, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As he reached for the handle, the door creaked open further, revealing the dark room beyond. Inside, it was just as Sarah had found it, the same old wooden chair and the doll, still sitting there, still staring at him with its unsettlingly lifelike eyes. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. He felt an icy breeze sweep past him, and for a moment, he could have sworn he heard Sarah's voice, a faint, desperate whisper calling his name. "Sarah," he called out, his voice trembling. Suddenly, the doll's head jerked toward him, its eyes locking onto his. The room seemed to shift, shadows growing darker, deeper. The air was thick with an unseen force, pressing in on him. Then he heard it, a soft voice, not Sarah's, but something more sinister. "You shouldn't have come." Mark froze, his blood running cold. The doll stood up slowly, just as it had for Sarah. He backed away, but his feet felt heavy, as if something was pulling him toward the center of the room. He looked around wildly, trying to find an escape, but the door had slammed shut behind him, just as it had before. Suddenly, the shadows in the room began to move, swirling and forming vague, human-like shapes. Mark could see them now, faint outlines of people, their faces twisted in pain, their eyes empty. And then, there, in the midst of the swirling shadows, he saw Sarah. She was pale, her eyes hollow, as if she was no longer fully there. "Help me," she whispered, reaching out with trembling hands. But before Mark could react, the shadows closed in around him. The doll's grin widened as the room grew darker and colder. The last thing Mark saw before the darkness consumed him was the doll's eyes, alive, watching him, as if feeding on his fear. And then, just like Sarah, he was gone. The house, once again, stood in eerie silence, waiting for the next curious soul to open the door.